to please welcome Dr. Bill Folk, who will be talking about international partnerships for medicinal plant management and development.
Thanks, Greg. And I also want to thank Shibu and also the sponsors for organizing this very interesting meeting. So I think what I'm going to do today is actually tie together probably most of the talks that you've heard up till now, and also provide some, I think, interesting topics for the panel discussion. I'm going to recount a few of the experiences that I've had working here at the university in collaboration with scientists across the world. But the principal lessons, I think, are applicable not only to international collaborations, but also to collaborations here in the United States. And these are ones which are not new to me. They're ones that probably all of you have learned. In fact, I'm going to reprise some of the comments that were made, especially in the earlier part of today's session. So I've had the benefit of being the director of a international research center that has been funded by our government, principally, the National Institutes of Health, working with scientists in Africa. I hope that we're going to get funding to actually extend some of these studies to Indonesia, and want to ask everyone to contact your representative in Congress to support international studies of the type that I will be describing now, because I think, as you will learn, they're extremely important for our health and also for our economy. And I sense from what is being said, what has been said recently is that we are going into an era in which opportunities for working internationally are becoming more difficult. They are certainly less likely to be funded to the level that I think that they should be. And I think there's great concern about this direction of increased looking inward and protectionism here in the United States. So I'd like to discuss that later when we have the panel discussion. But for right now, let me turn to a little bit of data. We are in a world which is now at approximately 7 to 8 billion people, and we may begin to level off at 10 billion, although I'm not sure whether that's accurate or not. We may just continue. Approximately half to 2/3 of those billions of people rely to a very great extent upon botanicals and forest products, plants, for their principal medicines. And this is because the Western medicines, the medicines that we and other allopathic physicians have developed, allopathic medical scientists have developed, are not easily accessible or not familiar to those that are living in the resource poor countries, the low to middle income countries. And they will continue to use botanicals as they have throughout the millennia. And most of the people that are going to be added to the world's population, we're somewhere in here, and another third or so of the people that are going to be added to the world's population are principally going to live in the low to middle income countries, where our medicines are simply not available to them and they're not culturally familiar with them. And so they're going to use these botanicals. And it's incumbent upon us in the developed world, where we have lots of medicines, to help them. Ethically, it's incumbent upon us, but also for our own safety. All it takes is one airplane trip from Africa to bring a new infectious emerging disease to the United States. We've learned that with Ebola virus. We've seen it again with Zika virus. There are continuing reports of the emergence of new strains of pandemic flu in Asia, and who knows what other emerging infectious diseases will come up, but there's certainly, we can predict that there are going to be many, and we need to be able to protect mankind against those diseases before they get out of control. Similarly, chronic diseases, diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease are huge problems all over the world, and we need to find better treatments for them than we presently have that not only will help us deal with these problems, but also people across the world. And so botanicals are a huge resource for new medicines, for the current medicines that many, as I've just said, will continue to rely upon, but also for the development of new medicines. About half of our current medicines are actually derived in some way from botanicals. And we know, because of now the ability to sequence genomes and to begin to understand the huge genetic diversity that biology has given us, that life has given us in plants and marine species, insects, that there's an enormous amount of information in these other living species that could potentially be used to generate new drug leads and should be used. Unfortunately, these living species are declining because of human impact upon the world, and we need to protect all of these different life forms for our own good in order to be able to then learn of these new chemical forms that might be able to be used in new medicines. So presently, just with the plagues that we currently are trying to deal with, HIV/AIDS, which began about 100 years ago, 60 million people or so have been infected with HIV. About half of them have died. We have some very powerful drugs in order to treat HIV infection, but we're only beginning to see the rate of infection of HIV in much of the world sort of stabilize, and we're not nearly doing as much as we should, or we're not achieving the success that we should here in the United States. The rate of infection of HIV continues to be a very significant problem, even though we have some of the best healthcare in the world. Tuberculosis, approximately a third of the world is infected with the tubercle bacillus. Most of these people are at risk for developing active tuberculosis, and we have very few drugs in order to be able to treat these individuals. New drugs have not been developed, and it's very difficult to treat some of these, and I'll show in just a second why that is. In malaria, again, about a fifth of the world's population is infected or susceptible to malaria, which is a very serious problem. We in the United States got rid of malaria largely through spraying the vectors that treat malaria, but that's not possible for most in the world that live in areas where there are lots of mosquitoes. And resistance to the available drugs is a very serious problem. And just to illustrate that point, here is a map from the World Health Organization about the growing emergence of drug-resistant tuberculosis. Now, I've become very aware of this because some of the work that we've done in our international studies has really caused me to focus upon drug-resistant tuberculosis, where I've worked with scientists in South Africa where drug-resistant tuberculosis is a huge problem. It's increasing. And what I mean by drug-resistant tuberculosis is tuberculosis that is resistant to virtually every drug that we have. That's a pretty profound statement. I mean, we don't have drugs that are capable of adequately treating drug-resistant tuberculosis. So if someone contracts drug-resistant tuberculosis, they basically have to go to the same treatment that people did before any drugs were developed for tuberculosis, go to a sanatorium where they're basically isolated and we all just hope that they recover. But we don't have anything to do in order to really treat the bacillus because it has become resistant to every drug that we've got. So we formed about a dozen years ago a center to study some of these botanicals that are used in Africa, and there are thousands of them that are used, in order to try to provide better understanding of them. And our government, our National Institutes of Health, was willing to spend some of its resources for this effort because at that time the government of South Africa was promoting the use of herbal medicines and botanicals over the few drugs that we knew could work with to counteract HIV infection. At that time, the HIV pandemic had just exploded in South Africa. The incidence in South Africa was about 30%. It's now stabilized, but 30%, think of that, 30% of the population had contracted HIV. And the fear was that it would totally destabilize, it would kill many of the individuals, many of the young people, especially those that were sexually active, and totally destabilize their society. And South Africa really is the cornerstone of progress in Africa, in virtually all of Africa, because it is the most developed of the nations in Africa. And so I was fortunate to meet some scientists, and we communicated with each other and developed common plans and approached NIH for funding, which NIH then awarded us in a competition. And so we developed this center, and these are some of the important take-home messages that I want to leave you with. This is actually now a slide from about 12 years ago. We worked very hard to develop these guidelines. We wanted to develop a collaborative environment of trust, communication, and research between the United States and South Africa to support scientifically rigorous ethical studies of African phytotherapies and healthcare systems. By healthcare systems, I want to emphasize that not only does South Africa have healthcare providers like those with whom we are familiar here in the United States, but actually the majority of their healthcare providers are the medical practitioners that have a very different view of healthcare. And they actually provide much, if not most, of the healthcare to South Africans. And there is very little communication. There is very little communication between those different healthcare systems. They are basically working independently, and the public is sampling from both types of physicians. The alternative, so-called alternative, but or the traditional healthcare system is providing much of the healthcare because they're accessible and they're out in the villages, whereas the clinics and the hospitals are very hard to get to. They're crowded, they can be expensive, and so only in acute cases will the people be able to go to those hospitals or clinics, and by that point, frequently the disease is too far in order to really be treated. It's really important to have better communication between these healthcare systems than there is. And as I'll point out, we've been able to achieve a little bit in helping that. We wanted to train scientists about how to study the botanicals using the methods that we know work, and in some cases even the equipment that you've learned about how powerful it is that we have access to here. Of course, they don't have access to much of that, but nevertheless, we were able to provide them with some of that. And then, this is probably the hardest part, is to communicate what we've learned about the botanicals to the people in a manner that the people will actually use that. And this is a real tough problem everywhere. It's not just in Africa, it's everywhere. We have known for years and years and years that smoking is harmful to our health, as an example. Only now, or about 30 to 40 years after we've learned about the harm of smoking, are we beginning to see a reduction in some of the diseases that smoking causes. So it's taken that long, even with some of the best communicators that we have in this world, in order to achieve what it is that really needs to be done, and that's communicate the scientific evidence to the public in a form that it is then actually implemented. And by doing that, to advance the health and well-being of our global peoples. Okay, so those are really the core messages that I want to communicate. I'll just spend a couple of minutes. This is the plant that we focused on in many of our studies. It's a little plant, but its size is no reflection of its importance in South Africa. It is viewed as one of the most important medicinal plants in South Africa. This is a picture taken in one of the botanical gardens in South Africa with a little plaque. They have a little garden with medicinal plants. And this particular plant was used and continues to be used by people that are HIV infected, as well as infected with tuberculosis and a variety of chronic, and suffer from a variety of chronic diseases. I have several other little vials of material of Sutherlandia that I've purchased at pharmacies in South Africa. You can buy it here in the United States over the internet. It's also being widely marketed now as a treatment for diabetes. So we conducted a lot of very basic studies with this. We've also conducted two very rigorous clinical trials using the best criteria that we could, with the support of scientists at the National Institutes of Health and the Medical Research Council in South Africa, in order to measure the safety of this plant. And if you're interested in learning some of the outcomes of our work, I have some publications up here, but I'm not going to delve into what we actually learned. Needless to say, we've committed a huge amount of effort to study this plant in order to determine its safety and potential efficacy, and we're continuing to work with this plant. And there's some interesting aspects, there are also some disturbing aspects about the use of this plant that we're following. But it takes a lot of effort and a lot of money in order to do this, and there are thousands of these plants that are being used in Africa. Who knows how many there are worldwide. This is a huge effort, and we need to find better ways in order to study these plants than we presently have, because we just don't have enough money or time in order to do this. This is an example. This is inside one of the clinics of one of the herbalists in South Africa, with some of the plant material that is available and that they are marketing and using. These are some of the physicians and healthcare providers with whom I collaborated, including the allopathic physician that led several of the clinical trials, who's a hero in my view. He works tirelessly to benefit the public that he serves, as do most of these other individuals. I'm not as well acquainted with them. A number of them are the traditional medical practitioners. And an important aspect of this was we were working together. We really made an effort through the years that we worked together in order to learn from the medical practitioners what they did, and they were very interested in what we were doing. And it's very clear that that has had benefit for the public that is in this immediate area, but it needs to be replicated many times over. And this young woman is a member of the staff at the National Institutes of Health that came several times to visit us to keep an eye on us and make sure that we were doing things that NIH thought that we should. So the products of our efforts were as listed here, and I've gone through most of these in terms of number. We've improved understanding of this particular plant and also how to study these plants. And also, we have greater understanding of how the traditional medical practitioners provide health care to the public. We've enhanced the training of a number of students from the University of Missouri as well as from the universities in South Africa. Over 20 publications in peer-reviewed journals. Fortunately, we were well-funded for this effort, but I can't emphasize enough, it's expensive. It takes a lot of money to do this sort of work. About $5 million in total from the National Institutes of Health to us and to the University of the Western Cape. So if you're more interested in any of this, I was fortunate to be recognized for this work through the award of a lectureship here at the university, and I gave a lecture about a year ago called Clash of Cultures on the Medical Frontier, in which I tied this work back actually to some of the very early ethnobotanical work that was done at the beginning of our history by Lewis and Clark in their expedition across the United States, which started here in Missouri, and in which they went to the Pacific Ocean and in return collecting botanical samples and trying to better understand what the Native Americans did. And you can Google this in order to see, if you're interested, my lecture, which gives much more detail. So I'm going to finish because I see Greg is right there, but I want to use several examples of other studies that certainly provide the foundation for much of what I have just talked about. All of us use aspirin, which was derived from the bark of willow and a few other plants that contain the precursor of aspirin in it, and which was independently discovered by peoples across the world at different places in different times as being of benefit for the treatment of fever and a variety of other conditions. And now there are dozens of drugs which have been derived from that understanding and knowledge, which we use in place of aspirin or in addition to aspirin for treating these conditions. Very, very important. This is clearly an example of what we ought to look forward to with these sorts of studies. And I want to mention a couple of examples where it hasn't been so positive. One, many of you are probably familiar with, is the story of the efforts to try to develop Western drugs from the neem tree, which is a tree from India, species from India, which is part of their culture, and about which there is considerable knowledge and understanding because of the extensive use that they have made of this tree over millennia. When scientists from the United States, the USDA and the W.R. Grace Company patented one of these uses, the Indian government protested and objected to the patent, and correctly that patent was then denied or revoked in 2005. So this is an example of what we don't want to do. We don't want to rob other cultures of their heritage and traditional knowledge. We want to work with them and ensure that that knowledge is protected and properly developed. Similarly, right now, and this is something that is going on right now, is the development of palm oil. And clearly there are real benefits for palm oil, and I'm not going to show, there's a link that we could go to, but you can Google palm oil and learn a lot about palm oil if you don't need to do it. large areas of forest, principally in Indonesia, are being cleared in order to be able to grow palm oil, and there's real need, and a few organizations are doing this, to properly conserve the diversity in the forests, but at the same time give individuals and communities the opportunity to benefit from palm oil. And this is a tension which really needs to be addressed as we go forward with the development of botanical resources, and this was emphasized in some of the early talks today. Very important that we do this. Here are the key take-home points. I think I've mentioned every one of these, except for mentioning that, in fact, there is an international agreement. Unfortunately, the United States is not a signature to this agreement, but we still should abide by its principles. The Convention for Biological Diversity, which defines requirements, generally agreed upon requirements for accessing indigenous and traditional knowledge and the genetic resources and ensuring that the benefits and commercial use of these genetic resources accrue to everyone. Can't emphasize enough that we abide by these principles and follow them as good practices. And if you're interested in this, I'll be glad to give you one of the limited number of publications that I have talking about this. Thank you for your time and attention.
Well, thank you, Bill. We do have time for a few questions. So if there's anyone who has some questions, we'll start right here in the front.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Bill, do you know about concentrated animal feeding operations?
Sure.
I'm concerned that they could be maybe a repository or maybe an incubation place for pathogens, and that they might be spread to the local people, or in this case us, I guess, just the people that work there possibly, and also if the animal waste is being spread on fields and it's going into the air and into the soil. Have you done any studies on this, or do you have any thoughts about that?
I have not done any studies on the potential or the microbes, but certainly having large numbers of animals together presents serious problems, can present serious problems. They have to be managed very well. We have, in the United States, I think we're attempting to deal with those. I'm not convinced that we're dealing with all of those adequately. One example of the concern I have is that in order to try to minimize the risk of infection, there's higher use of antibiotics in those animals, and that's a very serious problem for antibiotic resistance. However, outside the United States, where there's much less regulation, in fact, the potential for real harm exists, and that's in fact where the new variants of influenza, of human pandemic influenza, are most likely to occur, is in areas where there are multiple species that are able to allow influenza to evolve and then be transmissible into humans, can emerge.
Can't the use of these antibiotics, though, result in superbugs that, like tuberculosis? I don't know, do pigs get tuberculosis?
Sure. I mean, it basically lessens the utility of any of the antibiotics that are being used in those operations.
Are there any more questions? We have a moment perhaps for one more question. No? Okay. All right, please. Yes, sir.
I've recently caught a discussion by Wade Davis. I don't know if you're familiar with his work as anthropologist and a National Geographic Explorer-in-Chief for National Geographic. And he written a lot about preserving biodiversity, but what his theory now is that we need to save the cultures that have the relationships with the plants. And by saving the people, we will save biodiversity, and specifically languages. And the loss of languages is resulting in the loss of biodiversity of animals and plants. And I was just wondering if you've heard of his work, or what you're obviously well-traveled and been onto this subject for a long time. So I was just curious what your take is on that idea of.
Well, I'm not familiar with his work. I mean, there's certainly an issue there that we have to give humans, and hopefully other species as well, autonomy in making decisions as to what they want. I don't think it's appropriate for us to dictate to other humans how they should live, or to try to isolate them necessarily. And certainly it's been our experience in some circumstances, indigenous populations like to move to a lifestyle that is different from theirs, but also as an example, when Lewis and Clark traveled across the United States, or what was then the Missouri Purchase, they found many villages of indigenous Native Americans that had nobody in them because they had all been decimated by smallpox and other infectious diseases that had swept through with the early European settlers that brought them. And so this is a huge issue that we humans have been dealing with for centuries, and I don't see an easy solution to it.